Hey, thanks for joining us for the Acquah Inclusive Language webinar. My name is Kiana Minky and I use she, her and hers pronouns. I'm part of the content team in the Acquah marketing department and no surprise, I create a lot of content. I'm here today moderating this webinar because I'm both professionally and personally invested in creating content that fosters safety, inclusion and belonging. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that this webinar is recorded and you'll be able to access it on our website within 48 hours. I also hope that this conversation gets our audience asking questions, and I'm going to ask you to write them in the GoToWebinar chat. We have limited time and we wanted to focus on delivering a value-packed webinar. So we're going to answer your questions in a follow-up interview with one of our guests, Vivian. So joining me today, we have two fabulous panelists, Vivian Acquah and Theresa Hein. They have two completely different but complementary perspectives on inclusivity and inclusive language, but I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So Vivian, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Kiana, for allowing me to share, some of the DEI concepts here. So I am an inclusive workplace wellness advocate, and what I do is advise managers on how they can keep their people healthy, happy, and safe in a sustainable way. And the main thing of what I do is make workplace wellness and diversity, equity, and inclusion topics accessible for everyone. So by providing people the right tools for the right time and to embrace diversity and inclusive changes.
Fantastic. And Theresa?
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Theresa. Thanks as well from my side, Kiana, for organizing this. And I'm really excited to be here and to see that the interest in this topic is so big. So welcome everybody from my side as well. As you can see in my title, I lead a team of content strategists. We do content strategy, copywriting for all types of marketing channels. So yeah, we have eyes on a lot of content and yeah, safeguarding inclusive principles among other things, and yeah, also do localization and yeah, I studied translation and conference interpreting, so I come from a very applied side, I would say, of language, and I'm always interested to find practical and creative solutions to make language work. And yeah, we can discover some examples concerning inclusive language today together.
Fantastic, I can't wait. So the agenda for today, we're talking about inclusive language in a professional setting. So that's both within our organisations and with our customers and prospects through content. We're going to start with a broad overview of what it means to be diverse and inclusive, and then drill down into what that looks like when we create enterprise content. We're exploring how do we communicate inclusively, what are the challenges, what are the incentives, especially in business communication, what are the different aspects of inclusive language, and finally, how do we pair inclusive words with inclusive action? So let's start. The first question is actually for our audience. I would like to know your motivation for being here today. What brought you to this webinar? We're going to have a poll. So you might be new to this discussion and you're not sure where to start. You might already have an idea about what inclusivity is and you just want to know how to apply it to your content. I know that lots of companies going into 2021 are going to have inclusive language as part of their content strategy. You might be here to learn more, but if there's another reason, feel free to use the chat. Tell us what brought you here today. Cool. I see that a lot of you are interested in inclusivity directly as it relates to content. I really like that there's people here that consider your content strategy already inclusive. Fantastic. So let's get into some details. First of all, Vivian, I've noticed in my research about inclusivity and diversity that the two words are often used interchangeably, but they're not actually synonyms. So before we get started in the content side of it, how do you describe the difference between diversity and inclusion? Can you be a diverse company without being inclusive?
Well, you can't. If you want to amplify diversity and inclusion in your company, you can. So what I can do is show you by an example. And for those of you who haven't eaten, I'm sorry, but I always love to talk about food. So for instance, in this case, if your company wants to create the best carrot cake, you can bring in diverse ingredients. So bring in diverse people within your company, maybe people from different gender, maybe people from a different ethnic background, or maybe people from a different sexual orientation, right? The list goes on. But that doesn't mean that they will mix well, because you haven't set the right condition. And that's where inclusion comes in. In my example, I use the inclusion as creating the best kitchen environment so that you are able to bake your cake. But before being able to bake your best carrot cake, you need to provide people with the right tools, because person A might need a hand mixer, or person B might need a spoon to join in the conversation in creating that best cake. So a different way of explaining why your company isn't diverse by just adding diversity or diverse people in the company is diversity is having a seat at the table. Inclusion is having a voice. But the most important thing also in this conversation is belonging, a place where that voice is being heard. And most of the time, companies are trying their best, but what I see in most of the companies that I work with is that they are including people or having diverse people, but they haven't worked out their inclusion part yet. And that's where there's so much more that we can do so that people feel like they belong in the company as well. And I'm sorry for sharing food examples, but that's my best way to explain something.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is that diversity isn't always enough. We need to have an infrastructure in place to really make sure that our workplaces feel supported. And one of those tools is inclusive language. So considering that definition, Theresa, what does inclusive language and inclusive content mean to you, and what do they aim to do?
Yeah, so maybe I can pick up Vivian's example here really nicely. It ties in really well. You know, reading definitions about inclusive language, you often see inclusive language avoids offense. But there's so much more to it, right? Like this, having not only the seat at the table, but also having a voice. So I try to boil it down into some key aims of inclusive language and inclusive content, which is accessibility on the one hand. So yeah, that's maybe the seat at the table. Is your content barrier-free, for instance? What about its readability? These are questions you can ask yourself. The next one is representation. What do we talk about? Like, does it represent our readers? Does it represent a variety of different lifestyles? And then ultimately, respect. I mean, yes, of course, politically correct language is a very important buzzword here, but as I said, it's much more than that. It's we will take a look at the list later on. It's also avoiding normative terms, for instance, and yeah, depictions and so on. But even before that, I would like to stress that I think when it comes to creating inclusive content, it actually helps to ask us two basic questions in the beginning. And one is actually before we even start, is what do we publish? What do we write about? So inclusive content doesn't start when you start writing something in inclusive language. It starts much earlier when you select your topics. So you can already have that in the back of your mind. And then the next question is, how do we write about it? What do we depict? Of course, today we'll focus on the language, but it's also about imagery, and language is only one piece of that puzzle.
Yeah, I particularly like that it's more than just avoiding offensive language. It's about aligning the intention with the impact. And I think that, yeah, in order to think about it in this big holistic way, there's some challenges that come up for companies. So could you maybe suggest some of the challenges that global companies face in learning to communicate inclusively? Do those challenges translate into the kind of content they publish? What are the things that people struggle with to get started with this in their content?
So from my experience, a lot of the challenges are actually internal ones. And I hear that a lot when I speak to people from similar industries, but also different ones. And they ask me where to start. That's maybe the biggest challenge. How do we deal with old or non-revised content that's already out there? Do we need to replace it also? It seems like this huge mountain that you have to climb, and it might keep you from even starting. And another internal factor is how to get people on board. Different companies are at different stages, and I think that was nice to see in the poll that a lot of you already consider your content inclusive, or you're working on it. But there are other companies who are just at the beginning, and you might have to start by convincing stakeholders that this is an important topic that you would like to tackle, and being afraid of making mistakes. So I think these are all a combination of internal challenges. From the external side, what I hear a lot is, what if the market isn't ready? What if the customers that we speak to aren't ready for this? I think when it comes to how this affects content, actually, I think it affects content in a sense that it's not as progressive as it already could be because of fear and people holding back on being more inclusive. Maybe a little recommendation would be starting with small steps, because it can seem like this mountain that you have to climb, but you don't have to revamp your whole content. That's not possible, right? So you can start with maybe creating a network of internals who are interested, who would push this topic forward, and then gather some guidelines, and then you can start, step by step, implementing and revamping some content.
Yeah, that's a really comprehensive answer. Thank you. I've definitely looked at some of the work that Babbel's doing, and that you are well on your way to producing that progressive content that we're talking about. And I'd like to take a moment to highlight that Babbel's doing a fantastic job at leading the way and setting an example for getting started with content in bringing it up to what we'd expect it to be in 2020. For me, the incentive for companies to create inclusive content, perhaps when their customer base or market isn't diverse, is that it's not diverse yet, but that could change quickly when you start to speak to a wider audience. What do you think? What are the incentives for companies to create inclusive content? Vivian, maybe you want to start?
I would say, besides from it being the right thing to do, you also need to realize that the demographics are changing. You have a different generation. I'm not referring to the millennials or Generation X. You have people who are being more conscious about how to treat people, how to address people. And if your company isn't adding inclusive language, you might be missing the boat. You might not be speaking to your future stakeholders, which can be internal, but it can also be the external stakeholders. But also realize that using inclusive language from the inside out, so internally, is also a way of creating inclusivity. It's also a way of creating belonging. And if that inclusivity and belonging is showcasing from the inside and manifesting the energy towards the external stakeholders, that's when you create magic. That's when people and future readers can see you're doing your best to create that equity, equal world.
Yeah, I agree, and it's exactly that. If you speak inclusively internally, and that will automatically how you speak externally, and it will make your content so much more convincing, because it's not just a concept, it's not just even though there's a list here on the screen now, and I will talk about that later. But it's not just a list with boxes to tick. So it should start internally, and then you can externalize it. And yeah, I agree with Vivian that it's about making a statement. But I think there are also different ways to make the statement. And I talked about this fear before that some companies have, like what would the reactions be? And yeah, I think gender neutral language is, it's one of my favorite examples, and it's one of the most discussed as well. Yeah, it's a good example here because, for instance, in Germany, it's very common to use the gender Stern, as we say, so it's not surprising anymore. In other countries and other markets, there are some ways emerging to speak in a gender neutral way. In other languages, that's not even happening yet. So depending on where you are, you can take different steps. You know, you can be creative, and yeah, there are good solutions. Yeah, Vivian.
No, I wanted to build up upon what you just shared. Also know that the companies that aren't there yet, most of the times they are looking up. So the top 5 companies that already are ahead, or maybe the early adopters, you are setting the tone for the future companies. And my wish is that more people, more companies are embracing inclusive language. But then again, know that you are an early adopter, so it's also a good way to set out the tone and become one of the top 5 or top 10 or top 100 companies that are spreading out inclusive language.
Definitely.
Yes, and we're going to talk a little bit about later on in this webinar, a little bit about how it's not just inclusive language, we've got to pair that with inclusive action in order to be genuine about what we do, in order to foster true safety. So, but for now, let's drill down into the guidelines for inclusive content. So if we want to design guidelines for inclusive content, Theresa's mentioned one aspect of it, which is gender neutral language, but there's different aspects. So perhaps you can go into a little bit more about what are those different aspects that we need to consider or could consider.
Yeah, I always recommend starting with a simple checklist. I mean, it's not even long. You know, you can of course add things that are more important to your company maybe, or leave out things, but I think it really helps to kind of break it down. And yeah, gender neutral language, politically correct language, what are terms that we want to avoid, then really important as well as avoiding generalizations and stereotypes. I think some of these things might not be top of mind, but like what are typical relationship models or family models that you want to portray, or professions? Are they more connected in your content to males or females? All these kinds of things. Avoid normative terms. An example from Bubble that I can share is that, to make it a bit more understandable, we don't say another language. You know, we always talk about speaking a new language, because that has much more positive connotations, and we don't want to, you know, go into this otherness of, you know, it's a foreign language, it's another language. So that can, like, the language itself can create borders there. And really important as well, is it easy to understand? Is it accessible? Ask yourself what's the level of reading. For instance, when you create English content, you might have readers that are not non-natives, you know, or that are from different English-speaking countries. So keeping it simple is, I think, in many areas of life is a good advice, but it also definitely applies to content. And be positive, be respectful, just speak the way you would like to be addressed. And on the other side, you see the small list with three points as well, which might not be that comprehensive, but I think it really helps before publishing content to take a step back and ask yourself some questions. You can add some more if that helps you. Is it inclusive for all genders? Will everybody understand? Does it sound natural? You know, so is it still like easy to read and so on? So that really helps. And yeah, maybe also when in doubt, ask another person to take a look. That's always helpful to have a second pair of eyes as well.
Yeah, I think it's important not to assume that just because it's easy for you to understand, that your definition of easy to understand is somebody else's. So working directly with the community groups you're talking to is a really good idea. I actually wanted to bring up a point on does it sound natural? Because for a lot of people with gender inclusive language, it just popped up in my head just then, is that for a lot of us, learning to speak inclusively won't feel natural in the beginning. I think that it's going to take a little bit of time for us to adapt those habits until it starts to feel natural. And would it be fair to say that in the beginning, it may not feel natural, and that's kind of okay? That's part of the learning process. And
in some cases, definitely.
Yeah.
In some cases, definitely, I would say. But yeah, we will also see some solutions later where it's totally natural and inclusive. Mm-hmm. So yeah, like sometimes we think it's so complicated, like the gender Stern that I mentioned before in German, that you say SprecherInnen, and then you make a break to include all genders. So that's something very actively, like you use different type of interpunctuations, but also when you speak it, it's different. So it takes practice, of course, and yeah, so it's something that we have to get used to. In other cases, I think it's very actually natural.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. So we've got guidelines, and I think that actually lots of our audience members will be starting to think about including some of these guidelines in their 2021 content strategy. And I know some of those people are in translation and localization departments. Now, we've already touched on different, being able to be inclusive in the different levels depending on which language you're talking and how easy that is. How do we promote inclusive language in the field of translation and localization? Because I can imagine we've already said, it's much harder in some languages than others.
Yeah, definitely. And those here today who are from the localization industry, they will understand really well when I say that often we start from English as a source language, and English as a language, or the grammar of the English language per se, it's much more inclusive, or it's easier to be inclusive in the English language than in others, and so that can really give us a headache sometimes in the localization process. And then when it comes to UX writing, for instance, you also have to think about the length. So there's another added complication, right? So I brought 2 examples today, so maybe we can take a look at.
Share the slides with the challenges.
Hang
on a minute, we're getting there. There we go.
I like to start with a really simple example. I mean, you might say, okay, that's super obvious, but I think it really helps to understand what I referred to before, that sometimes it doesn't have to be complicated, you know. It can be very natural to speak inclusively. And for instance, when we say welcome Kiana in English, then okay, what will we do when we translate that into different languages? And I brought this example of Spanish here, that we would have to say bienvenida, bienvenido, but then we're not inclusive to all genders. We only mention male and female. So a very simple solution is just saying hola Kiana. You know, sometimes it can be as easy as that. That's why I like to share this example to show, you know, it doesn't always have to be complicated. So the next one, yeah, it already looks a bit more complex, I have to admit, and don't make me read that out loud because I have no Polish, but I think it's a great example from our internal localization process. So one of our taglines is speak the language like you've always wanted to. And then translating that into different languages, yeah, we ran into some challenges, let's say. In Polish, as you say, see here, when we say master the language like you've always wanted to, the verb form itself is gendered. So you would have to choose between male and female, and that's not inclusive. So yeah, you can already see in some languages, you know, it's much trickier. So the next attempt was, okay, what if we use an adjective? Be confident while speaking another language. That's also gendered. So, okay, not the solution yet. But in Polish, you can use an adverb and then you say feel confidently while speaking another language. And that's not gendered at all. And it's very inclusive. So, yeah, I think it shows.
What I can see there is that master is not a particularly inclusive term or way of expressing as well. I think that's another non-inclusive part there. But sorry, I cut you off while you were finishing what you were saying.
Yeah, and feel confidently is much more positive as well, you know. So yeah, I think this is a good example to show that sometimes it takes a bit of work, and yeah, grammar can be, you know, a hindrance, but you can also use it to your advantage sometimes, and it sounds natural in the end.
Yes, Vivian.
I wanted to include, because I know that this session is all about inclusive language, but I also wanted to say something about if you're using particular photos, images, or stock photo, I see that also being part of inclusive language. So if you are creating the best content, which I know you will, which is inclusive, please be mindful of what kind of image you're using, and also be mindful of rotating the image, right? The image that fits your audience, the image that is speaking to a broader audience, the audience that you want to target to. Rotate it. Don't showcase, you know, that one person or that one stock photo which your company is known for. Rotate it so that people can have a sense of feeling like, oh, this company is creating inclusive content. I'm curious about if they are inclusive from the inside. That's why I know that when your company is embracing inclusion, is speaking inclusion, but also doing the work from the inside out, it will showcase that energy from the outside.
That's a really good point, Vivian, that in part of inclusive language, we can't ignore inclusive design and accessibility, which actually have very little to do with language itself and more to do with representation. And can people find that information? Can they use that information? Do they feel seen? Do they feel represented? Can they, you know, it's about different literacy levels, the fonts that you use. Can you present that information in a way for people with disabilities that they can use an e-reader? So there's more to inclusive language than just language itself. So thanks for reminding me of that part too, because I did want to cover that.
You're welcome.
So guidelines are there to help people learn how to use inclusive language and use it consistently, but mistakes are inevitable. And I think we touched on it, that the fear of making mistakes is sometimes a really big challenge for companies. So what do we do when we've made a mistake, either individually or as a company, and how do we stay proactive about this, keeping a learning frame of mind?
Definitely. Before even starting with the content, I want to put some emphasis on train your people. And with train your people, I'm not referring to the tick in the box exercise, or how I would call it, the one night stand training, as you bring in the bias trainer or the bias training coach, and they do a training or a workshop regarding unconscious bias, and then it's done. I feel the work is done afterwards. So coach people with the examples that Theresa just shared. Coach people by using more examples. Okay, instead of using XYZ, why don't we try using a global language, so that people can be more consistent in the way they communicate? Because not only is the communication done via the communication department or internal comms or external comms, know that your employees or the people, the talent that work within your company are also communicating on behalf of your company. What if they aren't inclusive, right? So what if something happens? I would say apologize. Apologize directly, own your mistakes and be open about it, but also show, not only apologize, but also show what you are going to do to prevent this from happening in the future. I know that in the world we have this calling in and calling out and cancel culture. I'm more the calling in person, so calling in from the inside by creating constructive conversation or having constructive conversation. What can we do to learn from this, and what can we do the next time to do better? That's the only thing that we can do. Otherwise, the light bulb wouldn't exist if we wouldn't allow Thomas Edison to create a light bulb, right? So we also have to give ourselves some time to make these changes happen. Yeah.
Can I ask the difference between, and maybe some of our audience members don't know the difference between calling in and calling out. Maybe you want to just quickly find those two.
I see calling, yes.
And the other.
I see calling in from the inside out, where people or employees or customers are asking you or sharing their stories so that you can have a constructive conversation. I see calling in as a constructive way to make the change or create a better future or a better workplace or a better work environment. The calling out, however, is the way that, for instance, if I would have said that the carrot company is totally bad and I would post that on different social platforms, that's how the calling out is. And it's also similar to the cancel culture, where they are saying, let's cancel our subscription, or let's cancel this company, let's cancel this this streaming, right? And that's not what you want. So activate the calling in. That's where the heart is, and that's where you can meet, you can have these constructive conversations to do better.
Speaking of constructive conversations, Theresa, I'm roping you in for a bit of a we were talking a little bit about how Babel content has started conversations with people, and I said, you know, what do people do when they discover something in the app that is written in a way that maybe takes them by surprise? And I asked you if that actually attracted any kind of criticism, but do you want to just quickly describe the experience when people feel, you know, they've discovered something that has taken them by surprise, that is more inclusive or more progressive than they expected? What kind of reactions have you got from your content being? Maybe that's a good thing to cover.
Yeah, so of course there are also negative reactions, but yeah, it's as Vivian says, like it's also a decision to take to be like among maybe the early adopters. So you will, I think, inevitably get those. It's important to address that and to enter into conversation as well. But yeah, we also see a lot of positive reactions, and that's really motivating for us, you know, when we see our learners. I mean, I spoke a lot about, I'm usually referring a lot to the marketing content because that's what my team works on. But of course, we also have the learning content of our app itself, and we try to show, as I said, different lifestyles, also different relationship models, for instance, and in the imagery depict, you know, a broad variety of people. And we've had some really, really positive reactions. I can remember one example where a father wrote to us, and we showed in a dialogue exercise, I think it was a lesbian couple, and he wrote to us and said, it makes me so happy to see that, because that's the reality my daughter lives in. And he was really happy to see that represented, because yeah, it's maybe still quite unusual to see that in an app, or even in language learning content, which sometimes you know, can be a bit more conservative. So yeah, there are definitely these reactions which really fuel us to keep improving the content more and more in that direction.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing the potential when you bring a little bit of human spirit into the world of tech. Not only does it sort of set you apart from the competition, it actually has the power to just change individuals' lives, like this one father who just felt personally touched by the product that represented his family. And I think, how beautiful is that? Who wouldn't want that? Okay, I think this is actually the perfect segue where we mention that diversity and inclusion, we'll state it directly, it isn't a marketing ploy. And social justice doesn't happen overnight. Inclusive language is a fantastic place for companies to start, but it's only genuine when we are starting to combine this intent with action. And that's really important because more than ever, consumers are wanting authenticity from brands. They want to be involved with brands that hold themselves accountable in these ways. And so I think it's important to address some of the other things, like other than creating more inclusive content, what else can companies do to foster and amplify diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yes, I would repeat it again. Do the work yourself. So I wanted to state that you're dealing with different people with different starting levels when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I also wanted to state that within the company, that's the best place option to start with the training. But don't let it be just a one-off training. Have conversations about what can we do to do better. Have conversations about the reflective learning so that people can recognize and realize and recognize what they can do from that. So take the initiative to educate yourself, but take also the initiative to educate, to support those who are on a different level, because it's not about meeting each other at the middle, but supporting those who aren't at that level yet. That's also one of the reasons why last September I created Amplify DEI, which stands for Amplify Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. It's a Netflix version of diversity, equity, and inclusion, where you can learn whatever it is that you want to learn from different experts to amplify your own education or your own knowledge regarding diversity within your company, or attracting or retaining diverse talent. And also know that stakeholders, right? Stakeholders are also watching and reading and seeing what you are doing. So are you going to be the early adopter? Or are you going to wait until others become the early adopter?
I think I'd like to point out that in having these conversations, some companies might find it really important to start that conversation with a trained diversity, equity, and inclusion facilitator. That dialogue isn't something that we should necessarily expect to happen automatically, because we can sort of, I think that it's also helpful to get an outside perspective on your company, and that often we need some help having these discussions, even if we don't think we do. And I think that's sometimes a really nice way. I know we've got some diversion, equity, inclusion consultants in the audience as well. Yeah, really support the work of people who are doing their best to amplify these voices and get them involved as well. So it isn't just am I correct to assume that this isn't just something that happens in the HR department?
Yeah, definitely. It's not at all. And thank you for mentioning that as well, because what a diversity, equity, and inclusion, or D&I consultant can do is create that safety to have this conversation, create guidelines to have this conversation, but also help you with that commitment to create that better workplace, or create a better work environment for those who are willing and wanting to do their best. This is the time where your company, your people, your co-workers can really make that change for the better, because I have to say that more and more stakeholders are demanding for transparency regarding DEI. And if your company is not showing that yet, I would say start now. Start with baby steps, like Theresa said, regarding the inclusive language, because it's all about running a marathon. It's not about who is best at what. It's about running the marathon for the long term and not for the short term.
And then
And
Theresa, go for it. Yeah, sorry.
I would add to that yeah, it really helps to keep this conversation going internally, because as we discussed, it has to happen internally to become outside facing. Create some formats for conversation, you know, because we have to actively keep on working on it. I mean, yeah, at some point recently we got together with different content creators in the company and just exchanged on that. And that can also be a recruiter, for instance, you know, that's super important. How do we attract talent? Things like that, you know, so many different aspects and angles can come together. And if you create a platform to, you know, continuously have that conversation, because looking at the language aspect itself, language is something that always evolves, right? It's not that, okay, now we created a checklist, that's it, you know. It's something that changes, and that's amazing. Like what I've seen over the, I think maybe only last 5 years, how inclusive language has evolved. There's a lot of movement, and so yeah, we always have to get back to it, keep the conversation going, and see what is new, or did any standards change, and yeah, keep up to it.
Yeah, we got to keep up the good work. So whether that's reviewing your guidelines, your language guidelines on a regular basis, because it's worth pointing out that communities are continuously reviewing and assessing their own labels for themselves. So that changes within the communities you're talking to. And it's important to stay up to date as well. And keeping the conversation going, not only internally, occasionally involving some external guests, which is part of the reason why we invited you to be here today, is because Acquah is also on this journey, and we don't claim to have authority yet over these topics, but we want to be in the discussion, we want to be part of the discussion, and we want to have some kind of objective view into our company and how we're going. So, I mean, I can give an example of what we are doing as a company. You know, we're developing an inclusive language technology at the moment that plugs into our product. We reviewed our own code of conduct for inclusive language. That's a review that we will do regularly. We develop our own inclusive language guidelines that, yes, will be eventually integrated into our product, and we're putting a public-facing diversity and inclusion statement on our upcoming refreshed website. So that's some of the actions that we've started, because we don't want to just have this webinar and not walk the talk either. So we're actively involved as a company as well at the beginning of the journey, but committed. So I think speaking of action, this is a great time for another poll. I would love to ask our audience, which topics on diversity, equity, inclusion would you like to know more about? I would love to hear, based on what you've heard today, what you're interested in. Maybe you want to know how to make diversity and inclusion an enterprise-wide initiative. Maybe it's just started in HR. Maybe you want more specifically on inclusive content and inclusive language. You know, there's mistakes and some discomfort in this process in the beginning. Maybe you want a bit more about, you know, dialogue processes, being put in touch with the right professionals. Maybe you want inclusive language guidance in languages other than English, or maybe you want to talk about the role of technology in diversity and inclusion, because that's a whole topic in itself that can be discovered. So I'm really interested. It helps us tailor some content, bring you more guidance and support on your journey. And yeah, I think there's so many avenues that we can choose to go down, and I want to make sure that we are, as a company, supporting our customers and the people that we're affiliated with to do the best job possible in their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative. Wow, okay. More on inclusive content and inclusive language. Okay. The role of technology, great. Handling mistakes and discomfort. Either we're all very confident or we're all terrified. I'm not sure which one that is yet. And I guess it would be also handy to talk about inclusive language in other languages. We touched on it a little bit today with Theresa. but that's something, yeah, that's great. Okay. Actually, I can answer one of those right now. Let's dive into the role of technology a little bit. There's mixed views on whether technology has a positive role to play in helping educate people about inclusivity and inclusive language. We all know AI is capable of learning the same biases, yet we work with technology every day, and it seems impossible to imagine a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative without technology playing some role in that. So I would like to ask both of you, does technology have a positive role to play, or what do you think?
It can, when it's used wisely, when you have, like I said before, you have to do the work from the inside out. Or from the inside, sorry, you have to do the work from the inside before it will reflect on the outside. So if you are putting diverse people who are building into this technology, I would say it can have a positive effect on D&I.
Yeah, I mean, technology in many ways, it amplifies, right, what we say and what we do. We spend a lot of time using technology. I mean, be it social media, apps, anything. So technology can really, in both ways, amplify, you know, the message of the content. And Kiana, as you said before, like AI, that's an example where we're a bit like, okay, like we have to watch out that AI doesn't learn biases, for instance. But it can also amplify, you know, positive examples. And if the apps that you're using use inclusive language, for instance, if you see yourself represented in that, it can also be a really powerful tool.
I think it can be. Yes, Vivian.
I also wanted to add, test it with different people from different backgrounds, from different, I know it's a lot, but you have to test it from the inside out before you are going to showcase it on the outside. There are so many you know, communities that you can ask to include to testing the product to see if they feel included or if you're doing your best for the inclusion part.
Yeah, a lot of our customers and a lot of companies in general have a user experience testing phase as part of their product development. And I think that's also a fantastic opportunity to insert a diversity and inclusion initiative into your user testing. Are you testing your product on a diverse range of audiences? And I think I read an interesting statistic not long ago that said in Europe anyway, 91%, close to, it was the full stack developer survey from last year, showed that 91.1, I think, % of developers are still European white males. So it's really important also on the other end of our products, talk about data, have conversations openly when we are working with data and say, you know, whose data is missing from our data set? How can we work with this data better? So on both sides of product development, really making sure that we're also testing. That's a great suggestion. I think that this is a great time. We are slowly winding down to the end of our webinar today. And I wanted to say that for those companies planning their 2021 content strategy to include inclusive language, it is worth mentioning that Acquah Links, our platform, can check all your enterprise content for inclusive language. It's a feature that we've been developing for quite some time. It's something that's possible today, but we are planning a release in the new year with even more advanced capabilities. So that was something I think, you know, we are very conscious. We don't use AI in developing this part of the product because we are aware of the way that it develops the same biases. We have a fantastic team that I think I would love to later reveal and showcase. This is that we're super grateful for their input. I'm looking forward to testing it on a diverse audience. And yeah, I'm sorry to say that we're nearing the end of our discussion today. Stay tuned for what we have in the new year, and Vivian, Theresa, Thank you so much again for joining us today and sharing your insights. For our audience, thank you for being here. I hope that you found the information relevant, inspiring, and useful to get started on your diversity and inclusion initiatives, or progress if you're already well on the way. In the meantime, after this webinar, just to remind you, you can access it within 48 hours on our website. We also will be sending you the first ever edition of the Acquah Links Inclusive Language Guide, and we'll be publishing an interview with your questions that you may have asked in the chat with Vivian on our blog. So, ladies, is there anything else that you would like to add today?
I want to encourage those who are watching, or those who are watching the replay is start with one action and work towards, within 2 months or 3 months, work towards that one commitment where you are amplifying your diversity, equitable, inclusive content or your language. That's what I want to see. And also thank you for having me on this webinar as well.
You're most welcome. It was a pleasure.
I can only second that. Yeah, I think we said it several times. Start. That's the most important thing, and everything else will evolve. And yeah, thanks a lot for having me as well. Yeah, I'm looking forward to continue this conversation also. As I said, it's always evolving, so excited, yeah, for what's happening next.
Yeah, and both Theresa and Vivian have amazing work within their respective field on inclusivity and diversity. I would highly encourage you to check out their work as well. So thanks again for your time today. I wish you, all of you, a great holiday period. And I personally, from the Acquah Links marketing team, look forward to bringing you more great Acquah Links content in the new year. Bye for now, everyone.
Bye.